Good afternoon, students. Dr. Raskob here. I'm glad to be back with you, continuing our uh, progress through the Introduction to Public Health. Today I'm going to be addressing food and drugs as public health issues, and this is the material contained within Chapter 13 in your textbook, and we'll go through that here in this uh, short lecture outlining um, some of the most important issues. Now, the learning objectives are to talk about the ways that food affects health and disease. We will address briefly the steps in investigating a foodborne outbreak, and we'll talk about the burden of disease that foodborne illness provides to the uh, population health of the United States. We'll talk about the roles that the FDA, the CDC, and the US Department of Agriculture play in food safety. And we will talk about the phases of drug approval by the FDA and drug research related to approving drugs. There are some limitations of traditional approaches to drug approval. Um, Post-marketing surveillance of drug approval has an important public health uh, mission, and we'll talk about that. We'll summarize some recent changes in FDA laws that are there for food and drugs, and then talk about the other categories of products that are regulated by the FDA in addition to food and drugs. Now, uh, this slide and the next one illustrates just a couple of important milestones in the history of food and drugs. Indeed, the Food and Drugs Act goes back to about 1906, requiring that products have accurate labeling indicating their ingredients. And this was the law that essentially created what's known today as the FDA. In 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act required that there must be safety testing before a new drug can be made available to be marketed by a company. Very famous law, 1960s, the Kefauver-Harris drug amendments, which focused on the efficacy, not so much the safety, but mandated that drugs must undergo testing for their efficacy for the intended purpose of their use before they can be marketed. And these overlays of changes to the nation's drug laws were stimulated by the problems associated with thalidomide use and the resulting birth defects. Thalidomide was a medication that was being promoted outside of the United States for treatment of morning sickness associated with pregnancy. The FDA did not approve thalidomide, so it was not put on the market in the United States due to the very thoughtful scientific review and assessment by an individual FDA scientist. And this led to a real added focus on our system of ensuring the safety and the efficacy of drugs that are being made available to the public for health care. There were a landmark case in the 1990s in which the US Supreme Court allowed advertising of prescription drugs to the general public under approved advertisements. And so this is the basis for all these commercials you see on television. And in the early 2000s, there were some new food and drug laws to improve, again, the safety and protect the population, particularly as we observed an increasing number of side effects with medications and new medications. And with the globalization of the food supply, it was thought very important to tighten regulations on food safety. And it's noted now that here in the slide, as you see, the US obtains food products now from more than 100 different countries. So some form of regulation and monitoring is indeed important. Well, there are 6 ways, as was noted, that food can affect health and disease. Too little, undernutrition, inadequate calories; too much, which is manifesting in our society as obesity, not only due to too much food available, because indeed we have obesity at the same time as we have food insecurity for many of our population. So what we're really talking about here is eating behavior and how food plays into that. Deficiencies of vitamins and minerals, as is outlined in your book in box 13.1 for the condition pellagra, but there are others more recently, notably the fortification of bread with folic acid to prevent birth defects of spina bifida. Food may have contaminants, which are either naturally occurring or which can be introduced into food, either intentionally or unintentionally. And so, for example, there are a number of cases of intentional attempts to poison food and so forth. And this is important. Individual susceptibilities, most notably allergies, and many of you can see this in our society. In fact, the prominent one is peanut allergies, such that, for example, on some airline flights that I've taken, they no longer serve peanuts. Other allergies to food exist commonly: shellfish, shrimp, lobster, and so on, which can create a serious allergy as well, and a number of others. And then finally, and very importantly, foodborne communicable diseases, either bacteria or viruses, that are introduced into our system through our food. Well, foodborne communicable disease is indeed an important public health issue. I think many Americans would not know these facts, that every year the CDC has data to estimate that 1 in 6 Americans get some type of foodborne illness during the year. More than 100,000 people are hospitalized in our country each year due to foodborne illness, and over 3,000 die. This is very, very serious. Now, as in many other things with infectious diseases, the most vulnerable individuals are either the very old or the very young who don't have immunity, or immunocompromised patients who then are susceptible to serious consequences of infection and can't fight off any foodborne illness which they are exposed to. This slide outlines the steps in investigating a foodborne outbreak. It requires detecting a possible outbreak at the beginning. And the book talks about the distinction between a cluster and an outbreak. A cluster is a small group of cases. When that gets bigger and in a little more broader geographical area, we talk about that as an outbreak. We must define and find what are cases of this outbreak. It then involves coming up with hypotheses about what might be the likely source, and then testing these through assessment of people who have been exposed or not exposed and who have the foodborne illness, then finding the point of contamination and the source, controlling it, and then ultimately deciding when an outbreak is over, and for example, when it's okay to buy romaine lettuce again, which has been a common one in the news in recent years, because many of these companies that sell prepackaged lettuce, for example, for your convenience to use at home or in stores, use the same supply chain. And so this can be quite profound in how much of this lettuce can be contaminated across the country. And when is it decided that it's safe to resume eating that product, for example? That's a very important final step in this investigation. This slide is from figure 13.1. I'd like you to look at this and understand the steps of how we go through investigating a foodborne outbreak. And often it requires coming up with a number of hypotheses about how the food may become contaminated and how it is transmitted. But then when investigation turns out that there are not associations, we have to go back and do this loop again and find other pieces of items, information in the data to give us an idea as to how this food is becoming contaminated and the basics of how this outbreak is occurring. Okay, well, there are a number of agencies which are involved in food issues as they pertain to health. They're summarized in this slide, table 13.1, right from your book. There are global agencies, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, the World Health Organization. They are not a regulatory agency. Again, World Health Organization does not have any uh, authority over individual countries, but they work together to try and establish policy and guidelines, recommendations regarding food safety for the world. And there are several others, including Codex Alimentarius Commission and so on. Now, at the federal level in our country, the US FDA has overall responsibility for food safety regulation in the United States. Regulation. The FDA is primarily a regulatory agency. They approve products, they require guidelines for different processes of food safety, and they regulate, and they have the authority to suspend sales of a product, for example, or require a company to do certain things with its processing of food. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has also regulatory responsibility. So the split between the FDA and the USDA relates to what food. FDA has responsibility to regulate all food safety except meat, poultry, and eggs. That is under the Department of Agriculture. Now, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is important in that it regulates pesticide usage, and that's very important. We don't want high concentrations of those chemicals in our food. And they also establish water quality standards because a number of infectious agents can be transmitted through unsafe water. The CDC has a very important role in food safety. They are not a regulatory agency, but they do have responsibility for ongoing epidemiologic surveillance of food safety, as well as the investigation of acute outbreaks that they do in collaboration with the state and local health departments. State and local health departments are responsible for restaurant inspections. This is very important to make sure that these establishments are safe in what they're serving to the public. And the state and local health departments do undertake outbreak investigations of foodborne illness outbreaks supported and in consultation with CDC. The Consumer Protection Agency is a private organization that has a role in educating people about the safe preparation, storage of food, all of those factors. Well, what is being done in our country to prevent and reduce foodborne diseases, outbreaks of foodborne illness? And there is a collaboration of the CDC, the FDA, and the US Department of Agriculture on what's called the Foodborne Disease Active Surveillance Network, or FoodNet. You can learn more about this at the cdc.gov website here, /FoodNet. The goal of this collaborative effort is to identify and investigate foodborne disease from both outbreaks and from routine exposures. And so they are responsible for all kind of disease surveillance, including estimating the number of foodborne illnesses, monitoring trends in time for different infections, attribute illnesses to specific foods and settings, and then disseminating this information for use by all relevant stakeholders, health departments, healthcare facilities, the general public, and so on. Now, this network is a collection of scientists and staff members at state health departments in the states that are listed: Connecticut, Georgia, Maryland, Minnesota, New Mexico, Oregon, Tennessee, and selected counties in California, Colorado, and New York. Now, this gives a good geographic representation of the country. You can look this up on the website, and it will show you the sort of geographic representation of the country. And it actually includes about 15% of the entire US population. This network conducts surveys of labs, of physicians, and of the general population. So those are three key sources: laboratories, physicians, and the general population. They may ask about GI illness, have simply general public suffered diarrhea, other GI illnesses. Physicians, how many patients have been coming to you or to the emergency departments with diarrheal illness? Is there a spike in those illnesses? Does that give us a clue to some sort of foodborne outbreak? GI illnesses, vomiting, nausea, the symptoms that would be associated with a foodborne illness, either nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, other symptoms. And they can survey these, whether there is a increase in the presentation to physicians and healthcare facilities with these. They can survey the medical care seeking behavior of the public. Are they going to the emergency department for these things? For example, have they noticed an uptick, for example, in the purchase of diarrheal medications from pharmacies? That is done in Oklahoma City County, for example. All of the pharmacies report in their sales of diarrheal medications, and by this monitoring, we can detect early if there's a sudden spike in diarrheal medications being purchased, and then we can localize it to an area of town and so on. And this is a good example of how we can use data and databases and real-time data in disease surveillance. This network conducts population-based epidemiologic studies on the incidence of different types of bacterial or viral foodborne illness, but really they're focusing on these key pathogens here that are listed, mainly because these are ones that can cause quite serious illness and even death. Campylobacter, a particularly nasty bacteria, Cyclospora, Listeria, which has a tendency to cause meningitis, Salmonella, very common on poultry and other sources, E. coli, particularly, but not only, the 0157H7 strains, which can lead to quite serious clinical consequences of decreased blood counts, decreased red blood cell count, red blood cell lysis, decreased blood platelets, and bleeding and sepsis. And so these are important. E. coli, of course, common infection that occurs through the feces of cattle. When cattle are slaughtered, for example, there may be contamination of particularly the ground beef as it's made, or the runoff from fields where cattle are grazing may be contaminated. And if that runoff gets over top of a field that's growing lettuce, for example, or other things, this can lead to also important source of foodborne illness. And E. coli has been in the news fairly regularly over the last 5 to 10 years. And then 3 others, Shigella, which releases a toxin that's very harmful, Vibrio, and Yersinia, which is the bacteria that causes, one of the strains of Yersinia causes the plague, and is reservoired in rodents and rats and other animals. So they're really focusing on these pathogens, although there are some others they will look at. For example, norovirus, a particularly common virus that causes GI upset conditions and very difficult to get rid of. You've probably seen some of this in the news on cruise ships, where the ship came down with a norovirus outbreak. They have to bring the ship into port, let the passengers off, clean the ship aggressively, back out to sea, and the next thing you know, it's back again. So norovirus, very difficult to control. But it's very important that we have this network for the early detection and investigation of outbreaks. For example, if a local area in a state, for example, is reporting a lot of presentations to the hospital with something like a Campylobacter infection or so on, and if on inquiring among those patients they ate at a particular food establishment, for example, those are the type of clues. Or if they had food prepared in their home but used a similar product in all of the cases, or the same product, these are the things that would lead to clues about the source and cause of investigation and allow our surveillance to get on top of this fast before it becomes much more widespread throughout the country. Now, the U.S. does, the USDA also is involved in the issue of food security. Food security or food insecurity are people who do not have sufficient access to healthy food. That's a basic definition of food insecurity, the lack of sufficient healthy food or access to that type of food. And the USDA is tasked with working to ensure that all Americans have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy lifestyle. There are a couple of programs, you've probably heard of these. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, run through the USDA, called SNAP, or SNAP benefits. This is more generally referred to as food stamps, although that's what its formal name is. And this makes relatively expensive items accessible to low-income individuals, particularly with a focus on fruits and vegetables and other things, but that's not the only thing that is eligible for purchase under SNAP. And indeed, the big studies from Massachusetts of large numbers of grocery receipts indicate that the purchasing habits of SNAP recipients and regular customers, non-SNAP recipients, because when they have to show a card and when they scan, the grocery store can track what they're selling to SNAP recipients. The purchasing patterns don't really differ. Therefore, some politicians have suggested, for example, that controlling what is eligible for purchase under SNAP might be a step to combat obesity. This really isn't a viable strategy. Non-SNAP participants are also purchasing equally unhealthy foods, and it's a more broad issue in our population. And for some of these people, what they're able to get through this a program is really their main source of food and survival. Now, apologies, sorry. The second program that the USDA undertakes is called the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, or WIC, Women's, Infants, Children for WIC. This is typically administered through state health departments for supplemental foods, healthcare referrals, nutrition education, and so on. The SNAP program in Oklahoma is administered through the Department of Human Services. WIC is administered through the health departments. And these are principally, this program is for low-income pregnant women and postpartum women and infants and children up to age 5 who have a nutritional risk because of their socioeconomic status. Let's turn to drugs and talk about drugs now for the remainder of our time today. What's the big issue with drugs? Why is this issue in our current time, drug safety? Well, the National Academy of Medicine has estimated that nearly 100,000 Americans die each year as a result of the adverse effects of drugs. That's a pretty large number and a profound number. And this has become a high-profile issue in recent years, particularly related to some drugs which gave a lot of publicity to this. Vioxx is one. It was a drug that was sold as an alternative, for example, to drugs like ibuprofen, Advil, or Aleve. Vioxx was put forward as an alternative to those on the concept that it was safer for the gastrointestinal system. And it was found that the Vioxx takers had an increased risk of heart attack of about 5 to 7 per 1,000 people. But this was not found really until relatively later after its introduction into the marketplace. There are others, recent years, which have had some other side effects and have had to be removed from the market. And I'll talk a little bit about how we go about that. Now, this table outlines the FDA process for assessing the safety and effectiveness of drugs. There are phases of research that a drug has to go through under scrutiny and regulation of the FDA. If you're a company that has a new drug, you think you have a new drug treatment for a certain condition, then you have to go through these phases. Preclinical testing, first of all, which is a safety and assessment in at least 2 species of animals, looking at the potential of a new compound, new drug to cause cancer, carcinogenic, to cause birth defects, teratogenicity, and to cause fertility effects. Now, typically, these studies are done with relatively high doses or amounts of the drug relative to what might happen in humans. But the first step is to at least look at 2 species and to weed out compounds, particularly that have the potential for these type of serious effects. If those are seen early in the preclinical testing, that will end any further development of the drug. Any potential to cause cancers, to have birth defects, or to cause fertility effects in these animals will lead to any, termination of any further investigation. Phase 1, if the preclinical testing looks sufficient and the FDA grants approval through what's called an investigational new drug application, which is the permission of the FDA to begin testing in humans, then initial testing begins on healthy volunteers. Sometimes, often also terminally ill patients, but not on a broad range of patients who will need the drug. The main purpose of this is to evaluate the safety when the drug is given for the first time to people, first in a single dose and then in repeated dosing. For some drugs, we'll use healthy volunteers, typically healthy males between the age of about 80 and 40. The reason for that is we don't want to be introducing this drug, unknown compound, onto the background of the female reproductive system and so on as a protection. But sometimes the medications, for example, cancer treatments or immunomodulatory drugs or blood products, because of their risk, typically are not given to healthy volunteers, but phase 1 is done in patients with the disease for whom these drugs might be helpful and for whom they need to receive them. These are typically small numbers of individuals, short-term studies. The main purpose here is to document the initial safety and to make sure there are no major effects of the drug on safety. Phase 2 are small clinical trials, typically to again look at the relationship between the drug dose and safety, side effect outcomes, or other things. A range of doses would be evaluated, and to use typically biomarkers or surrogate markers of efficacy of the treatment of the condition that the drug is intended for, with the goal of trying to develop, pick a dose or 2 for full investigation in phase 3 as the basis for an application to license and market the medication. So here again, we're dealing with proof of concept mainly, and the goal of this is to identify whether the drug has sufficient safety and sufficient promise to proceed into phase 3 testing. Phase 3 testing is the large definitive step where at least typically and historically at least 2 independent randomized clinical trials have been required to establish the effectiveness or efficacy of a new drug for an indication. among an appropriate group of patients. New drugs are approved by their indication or their purpose for use. You don't just approve a new drug blanketly across many different conditions, but new drugs have to undergo investigation indication by indication. And so that's how they are developed. Now, in recent years, these randomized trials have been getting larger. Historically, they may have been smaller, and that's the basis for this limitation. They may be too small or of too short duration to observe all the side effects that would be seen in clinical practice. In fact, sometimes they even large ones will be too small to see a side effect, for example, that could occur in 100,000 people. So such a rare side effect, though, may be important if many millions of people are going to take the medication. So typically, again, these trials, these phase 3 studies, are to establish that the drug works for the purpose it's intended, to evaluate if it has any benefit over the existing standard care. It doesn't require that people receive no treatment. It requires that the new drug is compared to the existing standard care to determine if it can meet an unmet need. And typically we want 2 of these trials. If these trials are positive and lead to good data, then and show that there is indeed a benefit or a value of the new medication relative to its side effects, the company will then apply for a license to market that medication. That's called a new drug application, or NDA. And then phase 4 is a requirement for these companies to continue on evaluating in the early years after they introduce their medication into practice, mainly for the purposes of identifying rare but important side effects. Once a drug is approved for use, it can be used at different doses for different types of patients. A physician is allowed to prescribe an approved drug for any purpose. Research must be regulated, but doctors can use medications for appropriate therapeutic purposes in patients. And so the ongoing monitoring of new drugs introduced into the marketplace and into our use in clinical practice is very important to identify side effects that might not have appeared during the approval process of the medication. Now, you can see, of course, that it's not possible perhaps to always evaluate sufficient patients to see every relatively uncommon side effect. That's why this is crucial. And also you can appreciate from some of the news media that there's often tension between individuals who want companies to speed up the process of evaluating new drugs to bring to market to treat people with conditions for which there is not an effective treatment. But the other side of the coin is to not make sure or to not allow a medication to slip through that is harmful to the general public as well. And that's why we need this balanced evaluation. This is a topic that's undergoing commentary right now with the whole idea that hydroxychloroquine could be a treatment for COVID-19. Well, there's very little evidence that it's effective, but clinical trials are being developed and designed. And it's very important to do those because there's always the possibility that a new drug could actually make the condition worse for someone. And again, we need to properly evaluate them with a balance of appropriate regulation, but also work to be efficient in bringing new treatments to market that might benefit individuals. This is a very complicated, challenging area. The FDA commissioner is probably one of the most difficult jobs in the country. And our system is designed to protect public health, but there's always a policy debate, a tension about whether we have too much regulation, too little regulation, and are we protecting the public safety. One of the limitations of our phase 4 system is that in the United States, unlike some other countries, it is voluntary reporting by physicians or others of side effects, whereas some other countries have mandatory, legally enforced reporting of these side effects. So again, here, physicians or others who prescribe the drug are encouraged to report these side effects to the FDA. And we have ongoing rigorous evaluations, usually in the first few years after a new drug. More extensive follow-up of all patients who receive these products to look for any possible rare side effects that might have been missed in the development phases. FDA approval means that a company may market and sell their drug for a particular indication, the one for which it was studied and approved. Clinicians may take any approved medication and use it for any purpose. If they're using it for something that is not an approved indication, this is called off-label prescribing. The doctor has the ability to make a clinical judgment to do this. Of course, medical literature advances, and sometimes we learn through laboratory studies or other small clinical studies that some treatments may have other benefits that we didn't intend on. Doctors can utilize that in their care of people, but companies cannot legally market or encourage the off-label use of a medication. Even if the medication is approved by the FDA, the company can only promote it for its approved indication. Well, there were some changes to this Food and Drug Law in 2007 to make things more rigorous and give the FDA more authorities. Here you see that more representative patients be included in the trials, large linked database systems in pharmacy records, and the ability to use electronic medical records is an area that will be of, I think, increasing value in the future for monitoring drug safety. Also, there can be special restrictions with certain drugs early, rather than releasing it to all different specialties. It may only be able to be prescribed by a particular specialty who has a lot of experience with it until we learn more about that medication. That's a restricted prescribing. FDA was given new power to approve and monitor advertising, which I think is very important to make sure that that's truthful and accurate. And they can withdraw drugs from the market or suspend sales temporarily if issues are identified in their safety. Now, other products receive similar, rigorous evaluation. Vaccines undergo many of the same rigorous evaluations for safety before they're introduced as drugs do, but dietary supplements typically do not, and they do not fall under conventional drug products. They cannot be promoted as treatments for specific conditions. And the manufacturer is responsible for documenting the safety here, not the FDA. And there's a lot of debate about whether this is an optimal system, because there's all kinds of these different products if you go to one of the drugstores. And many people read on the internet and take these things for unproven uses, and they can interact with other medications that they take. So some have advocated that all of these products should be regulated to the same extent by the FDA in order to enhance safety. The FDA also regulates medical devices quite rigorously as well, biological products such as the blood supply, tobacco, and cosmetics. And so the FDA has quite a very important role in protecting public health. Well, that's the end of our discussion of food and drugs as a public health issue. I thank you. The slides will be also posted up on Canvas for your use and study.